It was midnight when the headlights appeared at the end of our gravel driveway, 3 black trucks rolling in slow, deliberate formation. Their engines hummed like a warning. I could see silhouettes stepping out, men built like linebackers, tattoos glinting under the porch light. One of them shouted, "Time's up, old man. HOA says you're done here." Inside the farmhouse, my grandpa didn't flinch. He didn't even look up from cleaning his old M1 Garand. "Gangsters," he muttered. "That's cute." The way he said it sent chills down my spine. Before I could speak, he pulled on his faded marine jacket and whispered, "Stay behind me, son. Let's remind them what a real homeowner's defense looks like." That night, the HOA thought they were sending muscle to scare a farmer. They didn't know they'd just declared war on a veteran who built this land with his own hands. Before we get into this wild story, drop a comment with your location and local time, and don't forget to subscribe, because what happened next will make you believe in karma again. For most of my life, the Whitaker farm was the kind of place you'd see on a postcard. 120 acres of green hills, rust-colored barns, and a pond that caught the morning light like glass. My grandpa, Frank Whitaker, had worked this land since he was 16. He fought in Korea, came back, and turned wilderness into home. He always said the soil remembers who treats it right. When my father passed away, I moved back from the city to help him out. After 20 years behind a computer, my hands weren't used to blisters anymore. But it felt good honest to dig fence posts beside him, feed the cattle, and smell wet hay instead of exhaust fumes. For a while, it was peaceful. Until the day they showed up. The new development across the ridge called itself Silver Oaks Estates, a gated luxury community with pastel mansions and ornamental fountains. It was run by the Silver Oaks Homeowners Association, a self-proclaimed symbol of order, appearance, and community harmony. My grandpa called it Plastic Paradise. At first, the HOA seemed harmless. They held barbecues and wine tastings, always smiling, waving politely whenever they drove past our fence line. But that politeness started to rot around the edges. A week after their president, Martha Whitcomb, took charge, we received our first letter. "Dear Mr. Whitaker, we've noticed your barn sits uncomfortably close to our new walking trail. According to county ordinances, it may constitute an obstruction of community aesthetics. Please remove or relocate within 30 days. Grandpa laughed so hard he nearly dropped his coffee. "That barn's been here since Eisenhower was president," he said. "The trail's 6 months old. Tell them to move their dirt path." I sent back a short reply, respectful but firm. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. Then another. "Your rooster violates our noise restrictions. Your cattle fence is unsightly. Your irrigation line crosses HOA boundary." Each notice was signed in the same perfectly looped handwriting, Martha Whitcomb, HOA president. Now, Martha was the kind of woman who wore pastel blazers and pearls to walk her poodle. She'd made a fortune flipping properties and believed she could civilize the countryside. She had that permanent half-smile people wear when they think they own the air you breathe. One afternoon, she pulled up our driveway in her white Lexus SUV. The tires crunched gravel like gunfire. I was fixing the gate when she stepped out, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Whitaker," she said sweetly, "we need to talk about your land boundaries." Grandpa appeared from the porch, wiping grease from his hands. "Do we?" he asked flatly. She smiled. "Yes. The HOA's plans for the new community park include expanding our walking trail by 40 feet right into this pasture." Grandpa squinted, silent for a long moment. Then he said, "You mean my pasture?" "Well, technically," she began, "the property maps are a bit ambiguous. It would be easier for everyone if you just signed the easement agreement. You'll still own it technically, but we'll maintain it. You'd be helping the community." Grandpa leaned his elbows on the fence. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "I fought in a war for this country. I didn't come home to surrender a single inch of it." Martha's smile thinned. She tapped her pen against the clipboard. "I'd hate for this to turn unpleasant." Then she turned heels, clicking on gravel, and drove off. That night, I found Grandpa sitting by the window, sipping black coffee, staring into the dark fields. "They think kindness is weakness," he murmured. "Let's see how they handle boundaries they can't buy." The next few weeks were strange. We started finding things around the property, spray-painted arrows on the grass, wooden stakes driven into the ground, and once a notice of construction sign planted right in front of our gate. I went to the county office. They shrugged. "We didn't issue any permits," the clerk said. "But HOAs can file intent notices. Doesn't mean they can act on them." When I told Grandpa, he just grunted. Intense enough to smell their fear. "Keep your phone charged." The harassment escalated quickly. Someone dumped a pile of old tires at the edge of our driveway. A drone buzzed over our barn every night, flashing a red light. One morning I woke to find our mailbox ripped from the ground with a note pinned to it. Sell now before it gets worse. I'll admit I was scared. I wanted to call the sheriff, but Grandpa stopped me. Sheriff's just a man with a badge, he said. These folks need a reminder of something older than law respect. He started preparing quietly, deliberately. Replaced the locks, fixed the motion lights, and set up cameras around the perimeter. He even put up a new sign: private property trespassers will leave in worse condition than they arrived. I told him it was too much. He just winked. Boy, sometimes you teach people manners the old-fashioned way. Then came the day Martha showed up again, this time with two men in suits. They claimed to be legal consultants, but one had knuckle tattoos that spelled pain, and the other's jacket barely hid a shoulder holster. "Mister," Whitaker, Martha said, pretending not to notice my glare, "our patience is wearing thin. We're offering one last chance. Sign the easement or the HOA will take action." Grandpa looked up slowly from his chair. "Lady," he said, "you're about to learn something important about taking action on another man's land." She tilted her head. "And what's that?" He smiled without warmth. "Sometimes the land fights back." She scoffed, turned on her heel, and left. The men followed one of them, muttering, "Crazy old man." That night, I noticed Grandpa doing something I hadn't seen since my childhood. He pulled out a weathered chest from under his bed. Inside were his medals, a pocket compass, and a small leather-bound notebook. On the first page, written in his tight block handwriting, were 3 words: Defensive Perimeter Protocol. He flipped through pages filled with diagrams, trap layouts, lighting zones, angles of approach. "You think they'll really come?" I asked. He looked up, eyes calm and sharp. "They already have. They're just waiting for dark." Outside, thunder rolled over the hills. I watched his silhouette by the window, the faint glow of his cigar cutting through the dark. He looked like a statue carved from war and memory. "Grandpa," I said softly, "what are you going to do?" He exhaled, smoke the ember, flickering. "Teach them what happens," he said, "when you mistake patience for surrender." That was the night I realized something. The HOA might have rules, but my grandpa had principles. And principles, when you've lived by them long enough, turn into weapons sharper than any blade. Because in Silver Oaks, the HOA wrote laws on paper. But out here on Whitaker soil, my grandpa was the law. 3 nights after that storm, I woke to the sound of engines again, not thunder this time, but something darker, heavier. I stepped out onto the porch barefoot, the night air thick with the smell of diesel and wet earth. Out by the far fence, 2 sets of headlights idled quietly. No one moved, but I could feel them watching. Grandpa appeared beside me, already dressed, holding his thermos in one hand like it was part of his body. "Don't move," he whispered. "They're just measuring courage." Sure enough, after a minute, the engines rumbled off toward the main road. But the tire tracks they left behind sank deep into our soil, right through the grass Grandpa had planted himself 40 years ago. I could tell that wasn't the end of it. The next morning, I found fresh boot prints behind the barn and cigarette butts near the fence line. Someone had been there waiting. I showed Grandpa. He crouched down, touching one of the prints. "Steel toes," he muttered. "Contractor boots. Maybe ex-construction, maybe worse." Then he smiled faintly. "They're sloppy. Good." That afternoon, the mail truck delivered a thick envelope, no return address, just the HOA logo stamped in gold. Inside was a single typed letter: "Final warning, cease. All resistance to Silver Oaks development. Failure to comply will result in forced removal through legal and extra-legal means. This is not a threat. This is a notice." Grandpa read it twice, folded it neatly, and slid it into his shirt pocket. "They've gone and said the quiet part, loud," he murmured. "Makes it easier for the sheriff later." I wanted to drive into town right then, but he stopped me. "You don't fight shadows by running to daylight," he said. "You wait until they trip over themselves in the dark." That night I heard him in the barn, hammering metal testing wires, adjusting floodlights. He moved slow but deliberate, the way soldiers do when they already know the outcome of the battle. I asked what he was building. He just said, "Insurance." By the 3rd day, word had spread around town that Silver Oaks was reclaiming parts of the Whitaker property. A few curious neighbors stopped by, whispering rumors about the HOA hiring private security contractors. Dale, the mechanic who'd fixed our tractor for years, pulled me aside. "Watch yourself," he said. "Martha's bragging at the country club about how her boys will handle that stubborn old farmer soon. If they show up again, call me. I'll bring my camera." Grandpa overheard and smiled. "Don't worry, Dale. We're filming our own movie." That evening, he invited me to walk the property line. The sun was setting, painting the fields orange. Every few yards, he'd stop and check something. A motion sensor here, a tripwire there, a post with hidden spikes under soft dirt. Nothing dangerous. Just Inconvenient. Back in Korea, he said quietly, we learned to win before the enemy arrived. Not by killing, by preparing. These people, they think intimidation is strategy. They don't understand what patience looks like when it's armed with purpose. I nodded, though, my stomach twisted with unease. What if they don't stop? He glanced at me, eyes calm but fierce. Then they'll learn what real property defense means. The next 2 nights were quiet, almost too quiet. Even the coyotes kept their distance. Then just past midnight on the 3rd night, motion lights flared near the horse paddock. I grabbed my flashlight and ran out barefoot. 3 silhouettes. One by the gate, one climbing the side fence, one crouching near the generator box. I could hear their low voices tense and hurried. Cut the power, one said. Then torch the feed shed. Make it look like a barn accident. Before I could shout, Grandpa's voice boomed from the darkness. Sun hit the switch. I slammed the breaker. Every light on the property burst to life. Halogens, LEDs, even the old barn lamps he'd rigged to car batteries. The night exploded into daylight. The trespassers froze like deer in headlights. Then the sirens started, not police sirens, but the kind Grandpa had installed from an old grain silo alarm. They howled across the valley, echoing through the hills. The horses panicked, kicking their stalls. The men bolted toward the fence. Too late. The ground beneath them gave way, not deep, but enough. Grandpa had covered the old drainage ditch with loose boards and hay. The men tumbled in, splashing into knee-deep muck and manure. "Welcome to the Whitaker Spa," Grandpa yelled, stepping out from the porch with his flashlight. "We offer free mud baths and humility lessons." I couldn't help it. I laughed, even as my heart pounded. One of the men cursed and tried to climb out, slipping on the wet boards. Grandpa leveled his old M1. Garand not pointed directly, just enough to make them freeze. "Sit tight, boys," he said. "Sheriff's on his way." I already hit the call button. One of them spat. "You're insane," Grandpa smiled. "No, son, just experienced." But then things escalated. The man by the generator box reached into his jacket. Grandpa fired not at him, but at the ground near his boot. The dirt kicked up, the sound deafening in the night air. The man screamed, dropped what turned out to be a lighter and a can of gas. "Fire and farming don't mix," Grandpa said. "You might have learned that if you'd grown something besides trouble." The sheriff arrived 12 minutes later, lights flashing. Deputy Collins, young and nervous, took one look at the muddy guests and sighed. "Frank, what the hell did you do now?" Grandpa pointed at the letter in his pocket. "Trespass, attempted arson, and stupidity in the 1st degree." The deputy cuffed the men radioing for backup. I saw one whisper to another. "She said this would be easy." "She?" I asked. The man glared but said nothing. Still, I knew who he meant. The next morning, the story was everywhere. Local HOA hires thugs to intimidate elderly farmer, fails spectacularly. The video from our cameras had already gone viral. Millions of views, thousands of comments. Some laughed, others raged, but everyone agreed on one thing: you don't mess with Grandpa Whitaker. Martha tried to spin it. She called a press conference on the steps of Silver Oaks Community Hall, claiming the men were rogue contractors unaffiliated with the HOA. But then one of them talked. He told the sheriff she'd paid them in cash and promised legal immunity. When word got out, the HOA board panicked. Half the members resigned overnight. The others begged Martha to step down for the good of the neighborhood. She refused. "That old man humiliated me," she screamed at the cameras. "He'll regret it." Meanwhile, Grandpa was sitting on the porch, sipping lemonade like nothing had happened. "You know what the best part is?" he said, grinning. "They haven't even realized that was the polite version." I frowned. "What do you mean?" he chuckled. "Every lesson has levels, son. They're about to take the advanced course." And when Grandpa said that, I realized the war wasn't over. It was only just beginning, and this time the battlefield wasn't just our farm. It was the courtroom, the town meetings, and the very idea of what ownership meant. Because in our county, land isn't just property, it's legacy. And Grandpa wasn't about to let anyone rewrite it. The morning after the arrests, the farm was unusually calm. The mist rolled low over the fields, the smell of rain mixing with diesel and hay. It should have felt peaceful, but there was something electric in the air, the kind of silence that comes before another storm. Grandpa was already outside, patching the fence the intruders had broken. He moved slow, deliberate, his old hands steady as a metronome. I walked over with 2 mugs of coffee and said, "You know this isn't over, right?" He took a sip, staring at the horizon. "I'm counting on that." Later that day, a shiny black Mercedes pulled up. Out stepped a man in a charcoal suit and sunglasses, the kind of lawyer who probably billed in minutes, not hours. "Mr. Whitaker," he said smoothly, "I'm here on behalf of the Silver Oaks Homeowners Association. I'd like to de-escalate this situation before more unpleasantness occurs." Grandpa smiled without looking up. Unpleasantness, son, you're standing on my lawn. You might want to define your terms. The lawyer cleared his throat. The HOA believes both sides may have overreacted. They'd like to offer a financial settlement to make this issue disappear, say $50,000 and a public apology. I almost choked. Grandpa didn't flinch. He set down his hammer, wiped his hands, and stepped closer. You want me to apologize for defending my own property. Let's call it a gesture of goodwill, the man said, his tone sliding into condescension. Grandpa chuckled, shaking his head. Tell your client this farm isn't for sale. Not the land, not my dignity, not even the dirt under your shiny shoes. The man's smile faltered. That's unfortunate. The HOA has deep pockets. Litigation can be exhausting. Grandpa leaned in, lowering his voice. So's a war you can't win. The man left without another word. When the car disappeared down the road, Grandpa turned to me. Now it's my turn. He disappeared into the house for almost an hour. When he came back, he was carrying a weathered folder filled with old documents, surveys, deeds, even handwritten maps. You see this, he said, tapping one page. This land's boundaries were drawn in 1957. Silver Oaks built their drainage line 12 feet over the line. That means part of their development sitting on our property. My jaw dropped. Wait, are you serious? He nodded, grinning like a man who just found a forgotten ace in his deck. Dead serious. And that means we don't need to fight their HOA rules. They're trespassing on federal zoning terms. We spent the next few days scanning every document, cross-referencing every map. Grandpa called his old army buddy now, a semi-retired surveyor named Dale Roberts. Dale showed up in his dusty pickup, unrolled his equipment, and spent 2 hours confirming it. Silver Oaks Park Fountain utility shed and 2 corner homes were built over our boundary line. Grandpa exhaled slowly. Well, son, looks like they've been living rent-free, Dale grinned. You could sue the entire HOA for encroachment. Or better yet, Grandpa raised an eyebrow. Better yet, what Dale smirked. Charge 'em rent. That night, we printed a sign and hammered it into the ground right in front of their community gate. In bold black letters, it read, Notice of Unpaid Occupancy. Portions of Silver Oaks estates are currently located on Whitaker property. Monthly land use fees now apply. Failure to pay will result in lawful reclamation. By dawn, half the neighborhood had seen it. Martha's phone must have exploded. Within an hour, she arrived in her Lexus again, practically vibrating with fury. Frank Whitaker, she screeched, stepping out of the car. What do you think you're doing? Grandpa didn't even look up from feeding the chickens. Collecting rent, ma'am. This is defamation. You can't post lies like that. Oh, it's not a lie, he said. Got the survey right here. He handed her a copy. She snatched it, her eyes darting over the numbers, her face drained of color. This can't be right. It's right enough that the county'll back it, he said. See, you built that pretty fountain 12 feet too far west. And those 2 houses down on Maple Drive, you're technically my tenants. For a moment, she looked like she might explode. You'll regret this, she hissed. Grandpa smiled. Already don't. Over the next few days, the HOA scrambled. They sent surveyors, lawyers, and even a public relations consultant. But Grandpa was 2 steps ahead. He'd already sent the proof to the local news, the same station that had aired the trespasser story. The headline the next morning read, HOA illegally built on veterans' land faces lawsuit. You could almost hear the collective gasp echo through Silver Oaks. By the end of the week, Martha called for an emergency board meeting. Grandpa decided to attend not as a guest but as a landowner with claims. He walked in wearing his old Marine uniform, polished metals gleaming under the fluorescent lights. I followed behind, carrying a folder of documents. The room fell silent when he entered. Martha stood at the head of the table, pale and tense. Mr. Whitaker, she said coldly, this meeting is for HOA members only. He tipped his hat. Then I suggest you call the sheriff because half your neighborhood's sitting on my dirt. Gasps rippled through the room. One board member whispered, Is that true? Another muttered, I told you we should have checked the boundary permits. Grandpa spread the maps across the table, speaking calmly but firmly. You tried to take what wasn't yours. Now you'll pay rent or move your fences. Either way, this ends today. Martha tried to smile, but her voice shook. You can't intimidate me. Grandpa leaned forward, eyes steady. Ma'am, you sent thugs to my home. That was intimidation. This is justice. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, one of the younger board members cleared his throat. I moved to suspend HOA operations pending legal review. Another chimed in, seconded, and just like that, the mighty Silver Oaks HOA voted itself into silence. When we walked out, the sun was setting over the rooftops. Neighbors stood on their lawns, some clapping, some just staring. Martha stayed inside, frozen, realizing she'd lost everything she'd tried to control. Back at the farm, Grandpa sat on the porch, lighting his pipe. You know, he said, puffing a thin stream of smoke fighting doesn't always mean throwing punches. Sometimes it means letting people hang themselves with their own paperwork. I laughed. So what's next? He smirked. Next, I make sure they crawl before they beg. Then maybe if they're polite, I'll teach them how to build a fence properly. The wind carried the faint sound of crickets, the fields glowing gold in the dying light. For the first time in weeks, I felt calm. But deep down, I knew Grandpa wasn't finished. He was patient, methodical, and he'd just begun teaching them what a real lesson looked like. Because if the HOA thought humiliation was the end, they were about to learn what comes after redemption the Whitaker way. For a few weeks, it seemed like Silver Oaks had finally learned its lesson. The HOA offices went dark. The fancy newsletter stopped showing up in everyone's mailboxes. Martha disappeared from her daily power walks. I thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. But Grandpa didn't buy it. He kept his rifle cleaned, cameras checked, and motion lights tested every night before bed. When I asked him why he was still preparing, he said, "Because snakes don't die when you cut off the head. They just wait for the Sunday." Turns out he was right. It was a Friday night in late October. The air smelled like wet leaves and diesel. I was fixing the generator when I saw a shadow move past the barn window. Then another. And another. At first I thought it was deer again, but deer don't whisper. I froze. A faint metallic click echoed in the distance, followed by the sound of boots crunching gravel. I killed the light and ran to the house. Grandpa was already at the door, holding his M1 Garand with the ease of a man tying his shoes. "They're back," I whispered. He nodded once. "Let's welcome them properly." Through the porch window, I counted 3, no 4 men creeping across the yard. Their faces were covered, their movements rehearsed. One carried a crowbar, another had a jerry can. The last 2 had something long wrapped in tarp, looked like tools, maybe weapons. Grandpa flicked the porch light twice, then off again. It was a signal one I'd seen him use with farmhands decades ago. Without a word, I ran around the side of the house, cutting through the dark toward the barn. The air was cold enough to bite. When I reached the fence line, I saw one of them climb through the wire, careful not to trigger the motion sensors Grandpa had hidden earlier. But what they didn't know was that Grandpa had added something new, a low-voltage deterrent wire invisible to the eye. The first man touched it and yelped, jerking backward. His buddies hissed, shut up," but it was too late. Grandpa had already switched on the floodlights. The entire field lit up like a football stadium. The men froze mid-step. Grandpa's voice boomed from the porch. "Evening, boys." Out for a walk, no one answered. One of them started to run. "Wrong move," Grandpa muttered, and hit another switch. Every motion sensor on the property triggered alarms, blaring sirens, howling, and sprinklers blasting ice-cold water straight from the well. The men stumbled, slipping on wet dirt and manure, trying to cover their faces. One fell face first into a puddle. Another tripped over a wheelbarrow and swore so loud it echoed across the hills. I couldn't help laughing as I recorded the chaos on my phone. Grandpa just stood tall, calm as a statue, watching them panic. "You got 2 choices," he yelled. "Drop your tools and crawl, or wait here for the sheriff. Your call, gentlemen." They cursed, scrambled, tried to regroup, but Grandpa had predicted every route of escape. The back gate was locked with steel cable. The front drive was blocked by the tractor. They were trapped in what he later called an educational environment. One of them, the biggest, pulled out a pistol and fired a warning shot into the air. I ducked behind the fence, heart pounding. Grandpa didn't move. "You done," he called out. "You fire another round and I'll let the sheriff's office know you brought firearms to a trespass. That's 5 years minimum. Your choice." The gunman hesitated, then lowered his weapon. Just then, red and blue lights appeared at the end of the road. The wail of a siren cut through the night. Deputy Collins again. Guess Grandpa had called before the fun started. The men panicked, running toward the back field. But Collins had backup this time, 3 squad cars cutting across the gravel road, boxing them in like a herd of trapped coyotes. "Hands where I can see 'em," Collins shouted. By the time the deputies cuffed them, the mud was up to their knees. Their faces were streaked with manure and humiliation. One of them, tall, bald, built like a bulldozer, glared at Grandpa and spat. "You think this is over, old man? Martha's gonna ruin you." Grandpa just grinned. "Son, you're standing in cow crap with handcuffs on. I think we're clear who's ruined." They loaded the men into the patrol cars. Collins came up the porch, shaking his head. "Frank, I swear, every time I get a call from this address, I know my night's about to get interesting." Grandpa shrugged. You're welcome for the exercise. When the cruisers pulled away, silence fell over the property again. I turned to Grandpa. You think Martha sent them? He nodded. Only question is why she'd risk it. She's desperate now. Desperate people make stupid moves. He was right again. The next morning we found out why. News broke that Silver Oaks HOA had been under audit for weeks. A whistleblower, probably one of the board members who'd quit, had leaked financial records to the county. Turns out Martha had embezzled nearly $60,000 from HOA dues. The money was supposed to fund landscaping and maintenance. Instead, it went into her consulting company and allegedly a few offshore accounts. Suddenly, everything made sense. The thugs, the threats, the desperation. She wasn't fighting for community pride. She was fighting to keep her crimes hidden. But now the sheriff's department had a full report, and those gangsters she hired were ready to talk. A week later, Collins came by again, grinning. You'll love this one, he said, handing Grandpa a printed court notice. Martha Whitcomb's been charged with fraud, conspiracy, and attempted coercion. Grandpa nodded once, not smugly, just satisfied. That'll do. But the story wasn't done yet. 2 days after her arrest, her husband, Richard HOA president on paper, resigned, citing personal reasons. Rumor spread he was filing for divorce. The whole Silver Oaks board voted to suspend operations indefinitely. Meanwhile, our farm became something of a local landmark. People drove by just to see the battlefield. Folks from town dropped off pies, thank you notes, even a new mailbox decorated with a little wooden sign, home of the Whitaker Defense System. Grandpa took it all in stride. People forget, he said one morning, watching the sun rise over the ridge, that standing your ground isn't just about land, it's about dignity. Once you give that away, you'll never get it back. I nodded, but I still felt uneasy. You think she'll come back, try something, he smiled faintly. If she does, she'll find out we're better teachers than she's ever had students. That night we sat on the porch, the air cool and quiet. The fields were calm again, the lights blinking steady. For the first time in months I felt safe. Then Grandpa leaned back, sipping his coffee. You know, he said, I almost feel bad for her. Why, I asked. He smirked. Because when I'm done with her, she'll wish the law was the only thing she had to face. I laughed nervously, unsure if he was joking. But when I saw that familiar glint in his eyes, the same one I'd seen when the headlights appeared that first night, I knew one thing for sure: Grandpa wasn't finished. Silver Oaks might have lost its queen, but the game wasn't over. And my grandpa, he'd already started planning the next move. Because for every action they took, he had a counter. For every threat, a response. And for every trespass, a lesson. They came back once with muscle. Next time they'd crawl back begging. And when they did, my grandpa, Frank Whitaker, the last man standing, would be waiting on that same porch, coffee in one hand, justice in the other. If there's one thing I learned from Grandpa that fall, it's that victory doesn't end with a sheriff's visit. Not when you're dealing with people who've built their entire world on appearances. The HOA might have lost the battle on our soil, but they still had one weapon left: reputation. And Martha Whitcomb, even under investigation, still had friends with influence. 3 days after her arrest, I opened my laptop to see a headline that made my stomach twist: Local farmer under fire for harassing. HOA, president leaked footage raises questions. They'd taken clips from Grandpa's security footage, the parts showing him holding his rifle and shouting, and edited them out of context. The article painted him as some unhinged old veteran terrorizing peaceful suburban residents. The story came from a glossy magazine out of the city, the kind that makes people believe the word community means control. When I showed him the article, Grandpa didn't even blink. They're losing control of the narrative, he said calmly. So they're trying to rewrite it. But I wasn't calm. I called the reporter. You left out the part where they trespassed. You left out the weapons. You left out the truth, the reporter sighed. Sir, I'm just covering both sides. The HOA's PR representative gave us access to official statements. If you want your side printed, you'll need to provide verifiable proof. Proof, I said. We've got videos, arrest records, and a dozen witnesses. Send them, she said flatly, and hung up. So we did more than send them. That night, Grandpa and I edited a full version of the footage, timestamps, uncut audio, everything. We uploaded it to YouTube with a title I'll never forget. They called him a crazy farmer. Here's what really happened. By sunrise, it had 1 million views. By noon, 10 million. The internet loved him. Veterans called him a hero. Farmers called him a legend. Teenagers called him the HOA Terminator. Someone even made a remix of him shouting, "Welcome to the Whitaker Spa," over a dubstep beat. When I read him the comments, Grandpa just shook his head. Don't glorify me, son. Glorify the fence. Still, the story exploded. Reporters came from all over CNN, Fox, even local radio hosts who used to mock rural drama suddenly wanted interviews. Grandpa agreed to one. Just one. It was live on local TV. The host, a young guy with perfect hair, leaned forward and said, "Mr. Whitaker, what message do you have for HOAs across America?" Grandpa looked straight into the camera, calm as always. "Simple. If you want peace, respect property. If you want war, bring a lunch, it'll be a long day." The audience erupted. That clip alone got 50 million views in 3 days. But not everyone was clapping. A week later, a letter arrived from a law firm in Lincoln. A thick letter. They were representing Silver Oaks Development Group, not the HOA. Apparently, Martha's little empire had friends higher up the ladder, investors, contractors, and a regional developer named Evan Lockwood. The letter accused Grandpa of defamation, obstruction of authorized construction, and harassment of public officials. They demanded $2 million in damages. I was furious. "They can't do this," I yelled, slamming the table. Grandpa didn't even look up from his breakfast. "They can do anything they want. They just can't win." He called his lawyer, the same old-timer who'd helped him draft the property, claims Mr. Larkin. A week later, Larkin filed a counterclaim, citing trespass, extortion, and emotional distress. He also attached something none of us expected: county audit records, proving Silver Oaks Development had falsified environmental compliance forms. Turns out, when they built their fancy park, they drained a natural wetland, a violation of state and federal conservation laws. When the news broke, it hit like a bomb. Silver Oaks caught in wetland scandal. Developer under federal review. HOA president's husband resigns after new allegations. Suddenly, the narrative flipped again. Reporters who'd once called Grandpa a menace now wanted quotes about his environmental heroism. But Grandpa wasn't interested in fame. He was interested in justice. He started collecting every document, every email, every recorded voicemail. The trespassers had left behind a disposable phone, and Dale, our mechanic friend, managed to retrieve some deleted messages. One of them was unmistakably Martha's voice, saying, "Handle it quietly. Make him sign. If not, make him afraid." We sent that to the county prosecutor. Within a week, new charges were added to Martha's case: criminal intimidation and witness tampering. It was a beautiful thing to watch the mighty crumble. But Martha wasn't done fighting. From jail, she gave an interview to a local paper claiming she'd been set up by vindictive country folk. She said Grandpa used violence to protect illegal land grabs. When I showed the article to him, he chuckled. She still doesn't get it. The land doesn't lie. It just waits. That night, we received an unmarked package at the gate inside a folder full of HOA documents. No return address, just a note that read, "You didn't get this from me." Inside were years of emails between Martha and Lockwood's firm. They talked about kickbacks, fake contracts, and how they pushed the old man off his property for expansion phase 2. We handed it to the county investigators. Within days, federal agents were crawling all over Silver Oaks offices. Lockwood's company's assets were frozen. And just like that, the empire that tried to swallow our farm began eating itself alive. I'll never forget the day they took Lockwood away in handcuffs. Grandpa and I watched from the ridge as black SUVs rolled out of the HOA parking lot. He didn't smile. He just said, "When greed grows roots, justice pulls the weeds." Meanwhile, life on the farm returned to normal, or as normal as it could be, with news vans occasionally parking near the fence. Grandpa refused every sponsorship, every TV deal. "I'm not selling the truth," he said. "It's not for rent." But the attention had one unexpected effect. People started sending letters from across the country. Veterans, small-town homeowners, farmers, all with the same message: "You gave us courage." Grandpa would read them aloud at night, shaking his head. "Courage ain't something you give, boy. It's something you remind people they already had." Still, there was one more surprise waiting for us. One morning, a man in a dark suit arrived, flashing a badge. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "I'm with the Federal Housing Authority. We've been monitoring Silver Oaks' case. We're freezing their assets and reclaiming illegally developed land." Grandpa raised an eyebrow. "So what happens to the land?" The agent smiled. "It's yours again, sir. Technically, it never stopped being yours. It took everything I had not to cheer." But Grandpa just nodded, as if he'd known all along. "Good," he said softly. "Let the land rest." That night, sitting on the porch under a pale moon, he turned to me. "You know what the funny part is?" What I asked. "They sent gangsters to my door," he said, lighting his pipe. "And now they're the ones crawling back, begging lawyers, begging judges, begging the same people they once called beneath them." He looked out over the quiet fields, the crickets singing in the dark. Never underestimate a man defending his peace, especially if he's got nothing left to lose but the truth. And with that, Grandpa closed his eyes, leaning back in his chair. For the first time in months, he looked at peace. Because justice had finally come full circle, not with vengeance, not with chaos, but with order, restored exactly where it belonged on the soil of a stubborn old man who refused to surrender. By the time spring came, Silver Oaks Estates looked like a ghost neighborhood. The fountains had been shut off, the manicured lawns turned brown, and the proud HOA Community Center sign now hung crooked, half-torn by the wind. The once perfect rows of tulips in Martha Whitcomb's front yard were gone, replaced by weeds and silence. But beneath that quiet, something was brewing. One morning, Deputy Collins stopped by the farm. He looked uneasy. "Frank, you might want to hear this," he said. "County court's holding an open hearing next week, public testimony for the Silver Oaks restitution case. They're asking victims to attend." Grandpa didn't even look up from fixing a tractor tire. "Victims," he grunted. "I'm not a victim. I'm the evidence." Collins chuckled nervously. "Call it what you want, old man, but they're expecting you to show." And so, on a bright Thursday morning, we did. Grandpa wore his best denim jacket, the one with his marine patch sewn on the shoulder. He didn't dress to impress, he dressed like himself. I followed him into the courthouse camera crews swarming like flies. The hearing wasn't just about trespassing or fraud anymore. It had become a symbol, small-town justice against corporate greed. The hall was packed. Silver Oaks residents filled one side of the benches, whispering among themselves. Some avoided eye contact with us. Others gave small nods of respect. At the front, the judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, called the room to order. "Martha Whitcomb," she said, "you are charged with embezzlement, conspiracy, and attempted coercion. You may make your statement." Martha stood slowly. She looked thinner, her hair no longer that perfect blonde helmet, but the arrogance was still there. "Your Honor," she began, "I admit I made mistakes, but my intentions were to protect our community's integrity. The Whitakers," she gestured toward us, "exploited the system, turned our quiet neighborhood into a circus, and humiliated us all. They're not heroes. They're bullies." The room murmured. Grandpa didn't move. He simply leaned on his cane, watching her like a hawk, waiting for a rabbit to stop talking. The judge turned to him. "Mr. Whitaker, would you like to respond?" Grandpa nodded and stepped forward. His voice carried through the courtroom like thunder wrapped in patience. "Ma'am, I built fences, not fights. I raised cattle, not headlines. Everything I did on my land by the law with my own two hands. These people came after me with lies, threats, and hired thugs, and I forgave that. But when they tried to rewrite the truth, that's when I drew the line." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small flash drive. "This is every file, every document, every recording you'll need to see who's been lying to who." He handed it to the bailiff, who plugged it into the projector. The lights dimmed. On screen appeared the recordings we'd gathered, Martha's emails to Lockwood, the deleted messages, the contracts. Each new image cracked the silence in the room like lightning splitting a tree. The final clip played her own voice from that disposable phone we'd found. "Handle it quietly. Make him sign. If not, make him afraid." The air went dead still. You could almost hear the blood draining from her face. When the lights came back on, the judge leaned forward. "Mrs. Whitcomb, do you deny this is your voice?" Martha opened her mouth, but no words came out. "Then the court has no choice but to consider these materials as direct evidence." Gasps filled the room. Even the HOA board members, those few who hadn't already resigned, hung their heads. The judge turned to Grandpa. "Mr. Whitaker, I understand you have filed a counterclaim for damages." He nodded once. "Just one thing, Your Honor. I'm not asking for money. I'm asking for boundaries." She raised an eyebrow. "Explain." "I want Silver Oaks HOA dissolved," Grandpa said firmly. "Every document they filed, every fake covenant gone. People deserve to live free of petty tyrants with clipboards." The room erupted in applause. The judge had to bang her gavel 3 times before silence returned. She smiled faintly. "You're not a lawyer, Mr. Whitaker, but you make a compelling argument." By the end of the hearing, the decision was clear. Martha was sentenced to 12 months probation restitution payments, totaling $8,500 to us, and a 500-foot no-contact order. The county also froze the HOA's remaining funds and suspended its charter pending community vote. It was over. When we stepped outside, sunlight poured down like victory itself. Reporters swarmed us, asking how it felt to win. Grandpa just said I didn't win. The land did. But fate wasn't done giving him one last moment. As we crossed the courthouse parking lot, a white sedan screeched to a stop beside us. The door opened and out stepped Richard Whitcomb, Martha's husband, former HOA treasurer. He looked wrecked eyes, bloodshot, tie, crooked. "Mr. Whitaker," he called, hurrying over. I just wanted to say, "I'm sorry." Grandpa stopped. "For what? For all of it," Richard said. "I didn't know what she was doing until it was too late. She ruined everything. I've lost my house, my job, my reputation." Grandpa studied him for a moment, then extended his hand. "You can rebuild reputation, son. You can't rebuild trust if you don't start with truth." Richard hesitated, then shook it. "Thank you." As he walked away, Grandpa muttered, "Guess he's the first one to crawl back." That night, the farm was quiet again. The cows grazed under a silver moon, the air cool and clean. We sat on the porch, the same place where this all began. "You think it's really over?" I asked. Grandpa nodded. "As over as things get in this world." He leaned back, lighting his pipe. "Funny thing though, people keep saying I taught those folks a lesson, but the truth is, they taught me one too." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah, what's that?" "That there's no such thing as small people," he said. "Only people who forget how big their principles are." He took a slow puff, watching the smoke drift toward the stars. "They tried to take my land, my peace, my dignity, but they forgot something I've already faced worse. I've faced men with guns, storms that flattened, barns, droughts that killed crops, and every time I stood back up, because the ground under my feet was earned, not bought." I looked out over the pasture where the fence line glowed faintly in the moonlight. "So, what now?" Grandpa smiled. "Now we fix the fence. Not because we have to, but because that's what you do when the storm passes." The next morning, neighbors came by with coffee and pie, laughing and congratulating him. One of them, Mrs. Thompson, patted his arm and said, "Frank, you showed them what happens when you poke a Marine." He chuckled. "Ma'am, I'm too old to fight wars. I just protect gardens." Later that afternoon, the mail arrived, a thick envelope stamped with the county seal. Inside was an official notice: property rights restored, all encroachments removed. Attached was a photo of the Silver Oaks sign being dismantled by workers. Grandpa looked at it for a long time, then handed it to me. "Frame it," he said. "That's better than any medal I ever got." And he meant it. That evening we had dinner on the porch: steak, mashed potatoes, and sweet tea. The sun dipped low, casting gold across the hills. Grandpa raised his glass. "To peace," he said. "To peace," I echoed. Then he smirked. "And to proper paperwork." We both laughed until the stars came out. For the first time in years, I saw my grandfather truly relax, not the calm of a soldier between battles, but the peace of a man who'd finally won the right to sleep without one eye open. Out in the dark, a coyote howled. The cattle shifted quietly. The world, it seemed, had remembered its rhythm again. And as I watched him, the stubborn, brilliant, relentless man who'd turned a farm into a fortress and a fence into a lesson, I realized something simple yet powerful. The HOA tried to bury him in paperwork, but he buried them in truth. They came with threats. He answered with patience. They sent gangsters. He sent them home crawling. And through it all, Grandpa never once broke the law, only the illusion of power they hid behind. That's when I understood why he always said, "The soil remembers." Because it does. It remembers the hands that built it, the sweat that fed it, and the courage that defended it. And for men like Grandpa, that memory is stronger than any HOA rule ever written. The weeks after the trial felt almost unreal. For the first time in months, there were no more court summons, no more angry letters, no more headlights in the middle of the night. Just quiet mornings with the smell of dew and coffee and the sound of Grandpa's boots crunching across gravel as he fed the cattle like he'd done for 50 years. But there was something different about him now, lighter somehow. The weight that had hung on his shoulders since the first day the HOA showed up seemed to have slipped off at last. He spent his days mending fences, repainting the barn, and teaching me small things I hadn't cared to learn before. How to balance irrigation flow, how to spot a weak post, how to tell when a storm's coming just by the way the birds fly. He said it like gospel simple truths carved into muscle and memory. "People talk about justice like it's some big thing that happens in courts," he told me one morning, leaning against the fence. "But real justice happens out here in the small things you keep right. A fence line that's true. A deal that's fair. A man who keeps his word." The farm was coming alive again. The fields glowed green, the pond sparkled after we dredged it clean. Even the locals who once whispered that the Whitakers were troublemakers now waved when they passed. Grandpa had gone from eccentric old farmer to small-town legend. It started small, a local newspaper feature titled "The Farmer Who Stood Up." Then a national magazine picked it up. Soon people began writing letters again. Some sent drawings from their kids, stick figures of Grandpa Frank versus the HOA. Others sent long handwritten notes about their own battles with power and fear. He read every single one. Sometimes he laughed, sometimes he sighed, but he never ignored them. "They're not writing to me," he'd say. "They're writing to the part of themselves that still believes right wins if you fight long enough." And then one afternoon, something unexpected happened. A black government SUV pulled into the driveway, not the kind that brings trouble, but the kind that hums with quiet authority. A tall woman in a Navy suit stepped out and introduced herself as Agent Ramirez from the Federal Housing Authority. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, extending her hand, "I just wanted to thank you personally. Your case exposed a pattern of fraud across several HOA developments in the state. Because of your documentation, we've recovered millions in stolen funds." Grandpa shook her hand, smiling politely. "I wasn't trying to make a name for myself, ma'am, just trying to keep what's mine." She smiled. Sometimes that's exactly what changes things. Before she left, she handed him a letter. "The federal courts finalized the property ruling. Your land is fully restored, all easements voided. Silver Oaks HOA has been permanently dissolved." He nodded once. "Good, maybe now the soil can rest." When she drove off, he just stood there staring at the land. "You know," he said softly, "I never thought I'd live to see the day the government gave me back something instead of taking it." That night, the sky was so clear you could see every star. We sat on the porch, the cicadas buzzing in rhythm. I brought him a glass of lemonade and asked, "Do you ever regret any of it? The fight, the chaos, the attention?" He smiled faintly. "Regret, no. I regret nothing that grows from truth. But I do wish it hadn't taken this much noise for people to see what respect looks like." I nodded, thinking back to how it all started. A letter, a fence, a woman who thought power meant property. It all felt so far away now, like another lifetime. He leaned forward, his eyes glinting under the porch light. "You know what the hardest part of all this was? What, not the nights with the headlights? Not the lawyers? Not even those thugs?" He paused, tapping his pipe gently against the railing. "It was waiting for people to remember that owning land means more than paper. It means stewardship. It means you take care of it, and it takes care of you." They forgot that. The HOA, the developers, all of them, they thought the land was something you manage. But land isn't a trophy. It's a trust. He looked at me, his expression softening. "You remember that, boy. One day this place will be yours. Don't guard it with anger. Guard it with gratitude." The words hit me harder than I expected. That same week, the county held a small ceremony to honor local veterans. They invited Grandpa to speak. He didn't want to go, but after some convincing, he agreed. When his name was called, the crowd rose to its feet, clapping until the echoes bounced off the courthouse walls. He stood at the podium, hands steady on the sides. "I'm no hero," he began. "I just did what my father taught me. If someone tries to take what you love, you don't scream. You stand." He looked out over the crowd. "The world keeps changing, but principle doesn't. Respect your neighbor. Keep your word. Build good fences. And never ever let fear tell you what belongs to you." When he stepped down, the applause was deafening. Even the mayor stood to shake his hand. On the drive home, I asked how it felt to be famous. He chuckled. "Fame's for people who need proof they mattered. I've got dirt under my fingernails, that's enough proof for me." Then he glanced at me grinning, "Though I wouldn't mind a free cup of coffee once in a while." The next morning, a delivery truck showed up with a crate labeled, "From the People of Silver Oaks." Inside were gifts, handmade thank you cards, home-baked pies, and a framed photo of the old HOA sign being torn down. On the back was a handwritten note, "You were right, Mr. Whitaker. Boundaries protect everyone. Thank you for teaching us the hard way." Grandpa just smiled. "Took them long enough." That night, I saw him sitting by the pond, the reflection of the moon rippling on the water. I sat down beside him. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said quietly, "Funny how people call it a farm. It's really just a mirror. You treat it right, it shows you who you are." I looked at him, realizing the story wasn't just about land or HOAs or revenge. It was about dignity, the kind that can't be taken, only forgotten. He reached into his pocket and handed me his old compass, the one he'd carried since the war. "Every man needs to know where true north is," he said. "Mine was always this farm. Make sure yours isn't a screen or a dollar sign." I swallowed hard. "I'll take care of it, Grandpa, I promise." He nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Good. Then I can finally rest easy." As the months passed, peace settled over Whitaker Farm like morning fog. The lawsuits faded, the reporters moved on, and the land healed. Grass grew where the fence had been broken. Birds returned to the pond. And though Grandpa never said it outright, I knew he felt it, that quiet satisfaction that comes when justice doesn't just happen in a courtroom but in the heart. He'd always said the soil remembers. Now I understood why. Because every scar, every victory, every stand taken in truth, it all becomes part of the earth. And the earth never forgets who stood for it. When the sun rose over the ridge that final spring, the wind carried his words across the pasture like a benediction. You don't fight evil with rage. You fight it with patience, proof, and a good fence. And that's how my grandpa Frank Whitaker ended his last battle. Not with bullets or lawsuits, but with honor, courage, and the unshakable belief that no man, no HOA, no threat in the world could ever outlast the truth of his land. Because in the end they came with greed and left with humility. They arrived as conquerors, but crawled away as students, and the old Marine who taught them their final lesson never had to raise his voice again. This story isn't just about one stubborn farmer, it's about all of us. We live in a world where people confuse authority with ownership and noise with power, but real strength is quiet. It's the kind of strength that fixes the fence instead of breaking it, that stands tall without shouting, that fights back, not with fists, but with proof. Grandpa's story reminds us that no matter how small you feel, the truth is always bigger, and patience, when rooted in principle, can move mountains. If you've ever had to fight for what's right, whether it's your land, your voice, or your dignity, know this: you're not alone. Justice takes time, but it does arrive. Comment below where you're watching from and tell me, what would you have done if the HOA came for your land? Don't forget to subscribe for more real stories of strength, irony, and poetic justice, because around here every fence line has a story worth telling.